Welcome to CISO Conversations, EU Data Regulations. I'm your host, Kev Johnson. We're serving you insights and best practices from leading experts on data security on how the rollout of multiple data regulations within the EU is putting everyone's minds to the test. Today, we're sharing how to improve your cybersecurity ahead of the introduction of the European Commission's NIS2 directive. To help us understand this better, we have Richard Cassidy, EMEA Field CISO at Rubrik, and Madeleine Bennett, a technology journalist and commentator. We'll keep today's episode short, sweet, and to the point. If you want just one brain twister from today's episode, make sure to flip your ears forward when Richard explains why NIS2 is a big step forward for organisations, providing a clear, streamlined framework to strengthen cybersecurity and resilience. Enjoy.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Madeleine Bennett, technology journalist and commentator, and your host for today's discussion. I'm joined by Richard Cassidy, Rubrik CISO, and we'll be discussing how to improve your cybersecurity ahead of the introduction of the European Commission's NIS2 Network and Information Security Directive. Cybercriminals only have to get lucky once to infiltrate and interfere with an organisation's most valuable assets, their data. This means businesses have to be one step ahead to ensure the best possible defence against any potential attack. Governments, regulatory bodies, and wider industry are coming together to collectively assist through best practice and regulation like NIS2. The deadline for member states to transpose the NIS2 directive into national law is 17th of October 2024. And the UK government has already confirmed it's moving forward with its own plans to update its cybersecurity regulations as well. With so much to consider, digest and do, in this webinar, we'll be offering advice and guidance on how to prepare and meet your obligations under forthcoming cybersecurity rules. So thanks very much, Richard, for joining us today. Can you give us an overview of Rubrik and your role there?
Madeleine, pleasure to be a part of the event, and thank you as well to everybody that's spending the valuable time watching and listening to what we have to say. So thank you for the introduction. I am Richard Cassidy, CISO at Rubrik for EMEA. Essentially, my role in the industry and in Rubrik is to help demystify a lot of the complexities around data security and cybersecurity. I'm focusing a lot at the moment on the cybersecurity frameworks, NIS2 being one of them, for example, which we'll talk about in the rest of this webinar. But also making the bridging the gap, if you like, between how we can get better at fighting the adversary in our day-to-day operations, and also how to use technologies that we have better in our existing environments, right? It isn't always about the new and latest shiny tool sets and toys. It's about doing things much more logically, much more effectively with what we have. So in a nutshell, my role is to help bring the value of what Rubrik does to organizations, but also to help organizations extract way more capabilities and a comprehensive security outcome from their existing tool sets and bring the two together essentially.
So, Richard, I'm now going to hand over to you to talk us through what companies need to know about NIS2.
So let's jump right into it. NIS2 is upon us almost, and there's a lot that organizations are probably stressing about that they don't need to necessarily, and we'll elaborate on why as we go through the next sort of couple of slides. But first things first, I think it's a very positive move, right? A lot of legislations, a lot of frameworks can be seen as quite laborious, quite cumbersome, and require a lot of resource to tick boxes, essentially, that don't necessarily provide the value that organizations are looking for. What I like about NIS2, and actually its sister one, DORA, which we'll touch on slightly, is it really does help organizations tighten their grip on security controls. We're seeing breaches proliferate at a rate of knots, and that's a story we've seen over the last decade or so, right? That isn't new. Attacks are getting more sophisticated, and we'll cover some of those points later. So what can we do about it? And I think the industry has gone off in many different directions and looked at many different ways to solve the problem. And some get it right and some don't. And I think what we're seeing with NIS2, for example, which is a massive improvement over NIS, the first version, is a real concise, converged control set that allow organizations to get very, very comprehensive in some real key areas that help them not just defend from cyber threats in a much more effective way, because we can never be 100% secure. We can only be as secure as possible, but also when the worst does happen, and then we have to assume it's a when, not if scenario these days, how can we recover and how quickly can we get back to operational efficiency and capabilities off the back of a major breach incident? And this is really what NIST 2 helps focus on. And so, look, why was it proposed? I think it's always good to start with why. I mentioned some of those reasons just there a moment ago. But really, if we think of all the breaches that have been investigated, all the announcements up under the GDPR data protection rule sets, there's been a lot of research done on where the insufficiencies were around the cyber capability and resilience capabilities of EU businesses. And so with those gaps, what you've seen is the legislators that sort of developed and wrote NIST 2, for example, kind of looked at where those gaps and inconsistencies were across all of the member states and all of the organizations that have reported the breaches, and really said, okay, well, how can we take this learning, right? Because tribal knowledge in cybersecurity and cyber resilience is the best knowledge you can achieve, because, you know, as Oscar Wilde once said, wisdom is knowledge without pain. And if you can learn from other people's mistakes, that's always a good thing. And so really what NIST 2 is an example of what went wrong in other cyber resilience and cybersecurity frameworks, and how organizations can now build a framework that is much more effective. And, you know, so that's really what the proposal is there to do. That's why the EU proposed NIST 2. And there's a little bit of a challenge in that there's a very limited time for organizations to get compliant with that. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, a little bit later in the webinar. But there's enough time, and that's the main thing. But if we think about what the big idea was behind it, other than the improvement on the existing NIST directive, there's kind of a lot of hyper-focused elements of NIST 2 that I kind of like, right? So if you think about these boxes at the bottom of this slide here, you've really got focus on, you know, threat and incident handling, which is something that's really important, right? If a breach does happen, the quicker you can share information amongst your peers and other organizations to kind of provide a kind of a multi-agency response to an incident, the better. So we're really seeing a lot of improvements around information sharing. But also, we're seeing a much wider scope across sectors as well. A lot of the other legislations that have come out have been kind of very focused on maybe fintech and finance. Others a little bit too wider reaching, but not really talking about the detail of what to do. With NIST 2, really, what we're seeing is a lot of focus in those key areas that are going to provide some real tangible benefits and outcomes to organizations. Now, the UK is an interesting one because the UK is not part of the EU. So if you're in the UK, do you have to comply with NIST 2? Well, the answer is yes. If you are transacting with other EU businesses or other organizations in the EU, you're going to have to show how you align to NIST 2. Now, there are other frameworks, and the UK is assessing how it may improve other existing frameworks to become more aligned to NIST 2. Or there may be a decision that NIST 2 is something that will be adopted here. I think that's quite likely. And organizations will then be mandated to follow that across the sectors that are affected. But essentially, the kind of burden will be upon the businesses in the initial stages to decide if they want to comply with NIST 2 or the UK government's version of both, as you see here in the slides. And there may be some divergences if we kind of look at initial documents that are created around the government's version in the UK of NIST 2. There are probably additional bolstered parts, but more or less they'll be very, very similar. So I think the takeaway here is, if you're a UK organization and you are transacting with EU businesses, you must comply with NIST 2. And if you're not, if you look at what NIST 2 brings, and we'll cover this off in a moment, it's actually a worthwhile framework for you to align to. There'll be a lot of benefits in doing so. Now, who is implicated? Well, there's over 160,000 plus organization types based upon research across all of the EU. And that number is going to grow, obviously. So NIST 2 breaks it down into three sort of core categories, right? You've got the essential category, you've got critical, and you've got important. Now, they don't change the points that you have to align to based upon the articles, but there is a hyper focus in certain parts of these areas. So again, the takeaway is you're going to fall into one of these categories. You need to know which one you fall into based upon how you operate as an organization, what your business does. And then you need to think about really how you're going to go about getting it aligned to the NIST 2 framework. And I think to kind of wrap up on this at a high level, it's good to simplify, right? There's over 46 articles and 44 preamble articles. It's quite a read if you do sort of go through everything in detail, and I highly recommend you do. But if you want the kind of 50,000, 30,000 foot view, NIS2 is aligned to kind of 5 key pillars. And you can see here, you've got security requirements right across to compliance with international standards. Where you're seeing the biggest changes in kind of uplift and sort of real shift in focus for organizations technologically from a process perspective will be around incident handling and the monitoring, auditing and testing and continuity of service. So there's a lot of real new functions and features in those 3 pillars alone under the different articles that cover them that will really force businesses to rethink a lot of their cybersecurity and cyber resilience strategies, and also how they share data traditionally outside of the organization. Because if you think about security, typically, organizations will have built very, very complex and comprehensive ecosystems, but they're very siloed, right? They operate for the business that they operate for. With NIS2, we're going to have to get a lot better at sharing the data amongst, other ESAs, right? So the European supervisory agencies, of which there are 3, and also other organizations are part of NIS2, because information sharing, as I said, tribal knowledge in cybersecurity helps us get to a point of operational resilience and operational recovery much, much more quickly than if we did things in silo. So I think that kind of wraps up the introduction to NIS2 and who's implicated and why, what the changes are. I think probably best to talk about very briefly the difference between NIS2 and some of the other legislations and frameworks that you might have heard of. So DORA, right, the Digital Operation Resilience Act, in a nutshell, and you can read on the slide a lot of the finer detail, NIS2 is focused on a much wider range of organizations, right? DORA is hyper-focused on the financial services sector, whereas NIS2, as you saw in those kind of 3 core boxes, right? Critical, and all these other organization types, really covers a lot of additional organizations, probably everything else that isn't covered in DORA. And in all due, to also bring a little bit more complexity to it, if you're a DORA-based organization, does that mean you don't have to follow NIS2? Not necessarily. You may be financially transacting, and therefore DORA is a framework you have to follow. But if you're running in any of the kind of key sectors that NIS2 covers, and that you have to also align to NIS2. So don't think it's one or the other. It may well be both for you as an organization. I think the final one to talk about is NIS2 versus GDPR. Look, GDPR really focused on member states' protection of personal data and sort of data privacy, whereas NIS2 is really focusing on how organizations operate their infrastructure to combat cyber threats and to ensure a level of cyber resilience. So it's not so much focused on the data itself and data privacy and personal data management, although there is a crossover in how you would notify of a breach or of a potential breach scenario, but one's more technically focused on how you do it. One's more focused on the data, protecting and ensuring that the user's information is used in the correct format. So they're the key differences between NIS2, GDPR, and DORA. Back to you, Madeline.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was really interesting, and quite a few points there that I think the audience will have found really useful. So interesting to hear you saying that NIS2 is a positive and it's an improvement over NIS, and that while there's a limited time for companies to prepare, there's certainly enough time. So that's really good to hear. And interesting as well that while this is an EU directive, UK organisations will still need to comply, even ahead of the UK government formalising their own rules. And finally, interesting hearing you mentioning that this is quite an in-depth read for anyone who wants to go through the whole directive. So very helpful, I'm sure, for the audience that you and Rubrik have already done that on our behalf, so that we can hear your views to summarise the really key core parts. So thanks very much for that. I've got a few questions for you now, if that's okay. So I wanted to start off by asking you, why has the threat landscape intensified in recent times? What is driving these changes?
So that's a great question. And what I'd like to do to frame the answer to that question is share some data from research here at Rubrik and other third parties. Has the threat landscape significantly changed? Are we facing a new breed of threats or capabilities on part of the adversaries that makes our life more difficult? Well, I mean, you decide. Let's talk a little bit about the landscape over the last 6 to 12 months. We're seeing a lot more enablement in the threat landscape. And what I mean by that is the attackers are able to use sophisticated tool sets in a way that wasn't previously possible. And I'm referring there to generative AI. And I know I've mentioned ChatGPT, but there are many, many others. It isn't the only Gen AI tool out there. And what that does is it empowers the adversaries to do a lot more with a lot less. And that's kind of really how a lot of operate, right? The biggest bang for the least possible effort. And with Gen AI, they're able to do that. And also, if you think about sort of leaks of tool sets by the NSA, a while ago, they're still in the wild, still being used. Very complex, comprehensive tool sets that allow all sorts of weird and wonderful intrusive capabilities. So, we haven't done ourselves any favor in the industry by those tools being leaked to the to the adversaries, but they're using them, and they're using them to great effect. And so the other thing you need to think about is, with this level of automation sophistication at the fingertips of the adversaries, what we're seeing now is the kind of new breed of script kiddies, as they used to be called back in the day. And these are essentially normally very younger kind of attacker personas that just like to go and play with technology and play with tool sets and see what they can do, but not really understanding the propensity of their actions. Well, these individuals have access to tool sets that can do very complex things that would normally require decades of training and coding and all sorts. And they can just fire an attack and build a piece of code by using plain English or their local language prompts into a tool set to give them an output that they want. So that means that we're seeing an increased rate of attacks at organizations that we wouldn't have necessarily seen thanks to tools like generative AI. But, no industry is safe as well. If we look at the kind of top 5, top 4, top 10 even, we're still seeing a lot of attacks on government infrastructure, on healthcare, education, finance is still getting hit quite hard. So not really a massive change in what's going on out there. But one thing I would like to wrap up on here is just how much more sophisticated and capable have the attackers become. Now, if we look at the kind of top 5, top 4 adversaries in this particular case, we've always focused on Russia, North Korea, China, Iran. There are others, okay, but these tend to be the 4 that a lot of the third-party research likes to focus on. If you think about their ability, back in 2018, to find a breach point, exploit that breach, and then move within the organization to create what we call other footholds. That means other points of entry that they can come in via. It took, Russia back in 2018, Russian groups, not Russia the country, but APT groups, around 19 minutes, right, to get in and break out. And then you can see that play out on the slide right through to Iran, which were, 5 hours. 2022, right, and the figures are yet to be seen in 23. We're seeing an almost 80 to 90% improvement on that. So what that means as organizations is, if you think about it, you have on average 280 odd days where organizations detect a breach. Well, if the APTs are breaking out in less than an hour in some of these cases, in less than 6 minutes, and you're kind of looking at a statistic that says it's about 280 days before I detect a breach, that's not a good situation to be in. That's why we have this when, not if mentality in a breach scenario. So the only thing that's changed there is not so much what they're doing, it's just how good they are at getting in and creating a foothold. And last point is, top threats really haven't changed a great deal, except, and this is relevant to NIST too, supply chain attacks are up, right? We know that. We're seeing attackers target vendors and vendor technologies which are deployed in organizations. If you can attack a vendor that's deployed in a company, well, then you can bypass those security controls. And also supply chain attacks in the traditional form, where they breach a weaker provider of a service to a larger company and use that as an entry point. Well, that's now in the top 5 threats of 2022, and I'm pretty sure it will stay in second place for 23, which means with NIS2, thankfully, NIS2 is focusing a lot on third-party providers and controls around how they access the environment and your resilience capabilities. So that's a real positive point, because supply chain attacks are becoming the real bane of organizations' lives at the moment. So look, there's a great sort of graphic here on how data is monetized. I think it's really important to understand, if your data is leaked, well, how is it resold on dark websites? You'll see from this org chart, essentially, it's a very comprehensive ecosystem, right through from people providing code that can infiltrate organizations to how the master criminal groups essentially sell and monetize that data. So be under no illusions just how well oiled this attacker landscape and ecosystem is. But knowing this, you can start to build a really, really comprehensive framework that is effective in delivering your cybersecurity and resilience outcomes. So yes, I know a long answer to your question, but I think a really important level of data nonetheless.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. It's quite eye-opening there, but as you say, it's good to know this so companies can be as prepared as possible. So Richard, do you see any differences or commonalities in the security challenges facing the private versus the public sector?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the threats by and large are the same kind of threats. And what I mean by that is similar tool sets are being used, similar breach points are being exploited. So, we're not really seeing a great difference in the types of tools that they're using, the types of capabilities. But we are certainly seeing, especially in the current economic climate, an increase on those that are in central government or critical national infrastructure for obvious geopolitical, brownie point, sort of war point reasons. But on the whole, by and large, essentially the security controls that organizations need to implement to stay one step ahead in terms of being able to recover, be resilient, and also detect aren't very, very different at all between both sets of organization types, in my experience, at least, and in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And what about globally? Does the UK face the same threats as other countries around the world, or are we more or less of a target?
Yeah, another great question. I think if you look at organizations specifically in Europe, we're seeing a lot more noise around central government, around even local government, and as I said, critical national infrastructure in the EU specifically. And there's been a lot of recent press over the past couple of months that kind of attests to that. In other regions of the world, like North America, yes, we're still seeing a lot of ransomware infiltrations and breaches, and we're still seeing, education institutions and financial institutions being targeted. I'm not seeing the same level of noise around critical national infrastructure as I'm seeing in the EU. And interesting enough, and you're not going to be surprised by this, but the number of breaches we hear about in China and those on the other side of the globe are far less. But that's due to other reasons, not because they're not being breached, I'd imagine, but because news isn't making it through to this side of the world. So there are differences at a high level. And, certainly, as I said, more central government CNI focus in the EU. But that doesn't mean you're safe in other parts of the world, right? You still have to consider these breach points and these particular attack vectors. But certainly there are some differences, at least over the last 6 to 12 months.
Thanks so much for that, Richard, and for your time today. As I said, I think a ton of really helpful advice there for companies wanting to get ahead of the NIS2 directive. And thanks to all of you, the viewers, for joining us today.
Okay, that wraps up today's episode of CISO Conversations EU Data Regulations. For more insights on navigating data regulations, join us next time when we invite Richard Cassidy and Madeline Bennett back into the studio to discuss how organisations can prepare for the fast approaching NIS2 compliance deadline in a few simple but impactful steps. Make sure to hit the subscribe button to avoid missing out on future episodes. This series is brought to you by Rubrik, which is on a mission to secure the world's data. With Zero Trust Data Security, we help organisations achieve business resilience against cyber attacks, malicious insiders, and operational disruption. With Rubrik Security Cloud, we help organisations uphold data integrity, deliver data availability that withstands adverse conditions, continuously monitor data risks and threats, and restore businesses with their data when infrastructure is attacked. To learn more, go to rubrik.com.